Welcome back to our memorization of Psalm 62, and we're in verse 8 today, which says, "Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us." Selah. Now, right at the start, it's probably important to acknowledge who this verse is directed towards. David again changes his direction in the psalm, and he addresses the people. You could even say that he's addressing us. He's addressing the congregation that's listening to this psalm, and he includes them in it. He invites them to join him in his trust for God. And I just want to detail out a little bit the outline of the psalm so far, because as we memorized in verses 1 and 2, we had the refrain that started us out, and then 3 and 4 is a description of the enemies, with verse 3 particularly being directed toward them, right? And that was the end of the first paragraph. And then in the second paragraph, 5 and 6 repeated the refrain. And then 7 and 8, as we've reflected on the last few days, kind of like a reflection, application, again, invitation, particularly in verse 8, an invitation to the people to join him in his trust. So that's kind of how the first two paragraphs have been working, and then of course we'll detail out 9 through 12 as we go through them. But just noting, I guess, the times in which he's changed his direction. First with the enemies in verse 3. We could probably even say in verse 5, toward himself, when he said, "Wait in silence," he commanded himself. And then in verse 8, he turns his direction toward the people. Now, what is he encouraging them to do? He's encouraging them to trust in God, right? And this has been kind of an unspoken, to this point, application of the truths that we've reflected on. So he brings it out here, and then he's actually going to talk about it as well in verse 10. In verse 10, he talks about improper things that we may trust in. But here in verse 8, he calls us to a proper trust in God. Now, why would that be? Well, because if we reflect back in at least 5 and 6, then we know that our source of hope, and from verse 1, our source of salvation is God. And then he is our rock, he's our salvation, he's our fortress. So because of all of these things, the only proper response that we can have is trust. So it's kind of like an application verse 8 is. And he invites us to join him. So he says, trust in him when? At all times. Again, as he's repeated throughout the psalm, circumstances don't drive our theology, right? The truth and character of God drives our theology, so it's consistent at all times. In all circumstances, we should continue to trust. And then the second phrase is probably one of the most encouraging in the psalm. He says, pour out your heart before him. So that first idea of pouring out your heart is, in a word, we would probably describe this as lament. And what David's doing, or what lament even does, is it invites us to openness and to honesty, to express those deep-seated thoughts and emotions that you feel during trials, perhaps even injustices. And what he doesn't call for us to do is to kind of bottle those up. Instead, he says, express them. And it's one part of what lament does is it does sort of function as a release valve, right? It allows us to say things that we might otherwise be frightened or even fearful to say out loud. So there's this open invitation to pour out our hearts. But this invitation is qualified, right, by the second part, which says, pour it out before him. So he's not calling us to take to the keyboard and write these things out on social media. He's not even calling for us to go to our therapist and express these things. He's not calling for us to go to your best friend or to your pastor or to anyone. Not that those things are bad necessarily. There can be some great benefit in doing those things, right? As we learned in Ecclesiastes, there's great joy and comfort in community and in relationship. So we should perhaps do some of those things. But here what he's calling for us to do is to lament before God. Just as we're called to trust God, we're called to lament before God as well. And so we just need to observe that it's not the fact of lament, right? It's not pouring out or expressing ourselves that is key, but the one to whom we lament is what's key. And this only makes sense, again, because of what we looked at in 5 and 6. Well, it's repeated in verse 7 too. If it's true that our salvation and our glory rest on God, if it's true that God is our mighty rock, if it's true that God is our refuge, then it would be foolish for us to exclude God from our lament. Which is what he takes us to in the last phrase. He reviews again, God is a refuge for us. So we have that repetition from verse 7, which again was an expression of the metaphor of God as our fortress, or an explanation of that metaphor. God is a refuge for us. That's why we should trust him. That's why we should lament to him. It's because he is our refuge. And then, of course, he wraps it up with Selah, concluding the second paragraph and encouraging us to think on these things. So, as you say, verse 8 25 times, you could also note, it might be helpful that there are actually 8 words in the first phrase of verse 8. That might be helpful. But as you reflect on this, I pray that you would accept David's invitation to join him in confident trust, expressed through lament, in God as our rock and our fortress.